So we should be able to see this from finding to doing. And this is definitely as well, I want to give a shout out to Misha Cobb. She's a designer at Craft, and she did all of these beautiful illustrations for me. So that's on Misha, that's not on me, but you'll see them pop up throughout our talk today. So from finding to doing, communicating outputs for increasing impact of user research. What we'll be chatting through today is this continuum of outputs that I rely on kind of in any study to figure out at what point am I communicating something, how am I communicating it, what is the way that I want to communicate it. And at each of these different moments in the process, the structure and way of communication is slightly different, I found. And that's kind of dependent on the situation as well as the study and all of that. But I'll just share with you some things that I've learned in terms of communicating data. So what was said, communicating findings, what was heard, communicating insights, what it means, frameworks, how we think about it, opportunities, what we could do, and then recommendations, what we should do. So this might reflect your process and it might not, and that's okay either way. There's a million different ways of doing this. I'm just hoping to share today the way that I think about it to hopefully give you something to think about. And yeah, let's dig into it. So by the end of this chat, hopefully you'll have a clear, concise way to contextualize and communicate your research outputs at any stage in the research process. And really this whole idea for this talk is based on the question of, if a research study happens and no one knows what to do with it, did it even happen? So making sure that we're able to communicate what we find in our research study is almost as important as what it is we find. So tree falls in the woods, did it even fall? Research study, if you don't know what to do with it, you might as well not have done it. So I'm trying to avoid that in all of the studies that I do. So I just want to give a little bit of background about myself. I don't want to belabor the point here at all. I'm a design researcher. I'm based in Philadelphia, as Sina mentioned. I graduated Drexel University with a degree in product design. And for the past 6 or 7 years or so, I've worked at different UX and industrial design agencies in the Philadelphia area. I also worked for 6 months when I was an undergrad in Germany at SAP, but that's a story for another day. Through working at these different agencies, I've accumulated a lot of knowledge about a lot of different industries. And so hopefully that comes through in my talk today as well. This process has been applicable for anything from a project about dry shampoo to a project about diabetic pen needles. So thinking through the whole gamut of all of the different types of design we do, I find that this process applies to that. I'm also a design educator, like Sina mentioned. So I work as an adjunct professor at Drexel in Philadelphia with product design students, teaching a human-centered design process, as well as mentoring senior product design students through their senior thesis. And I'm currently at a design agency called Craft, and I am loving it. So if you have any questions about that, you can feel free to reach out to me at the end of the talk. And on the right there, I just wanted to show my cat Henry because he sometimes makes appearances, and do not be alarmed. So we're walking through the introduction now. Hopefully you don't want to spend too much time just with me talking. I'd like this to end up being more of a conversation with everybody. So we'll hopefully get through the outputs continuum in about 20 minutes and then spend some time reflecting on it. And then finally, we'll chat at the end all together. So getting into the outputs, like I mentioned, this is what we're walking through: data, findings, insights, frameworks, opportunities, recommendations. I kind of think about this as like there's a thread that pulls through from the end of a study, a piece of data. So you're kind of flipping the data and massaging it and changing it and building on it as it goes through these different gates. And there are certain studies where you can end at insights, and that's fine. There are certain studies where you want to end at a framework, and that's okay too. And then there are certain studies where you have to go the whole way through to recommendations and into building a roadmap. But that little piece of data that you have at the end of an interview study or any kind of study, you're kind of building a finding around it. You're then switching that finding and accumulating it with other findings to develop an insight. then organizing those insights into a framework so you can see how insights all relate to each other, defining opportunities for design, and then thinking about what actually needs to be done out of those opportunities. So we'll walk through each of these step by step. And like I mentioned, if this is super familiar to you and you know this all already, that is cool. Feel free to just like write down some questions or thoughts as we go along, and we can chat at the end. So getting into data, data is what was said. So it's the raw stuff, it's the exact words of a participant, the ranking values, the pass-fail rates, and there's zero interpretation applied to that data whatsoever. And so I like to think about data even at the point of like, I'm not even looking at across participants, I'm looking at a single participant's piece of data at this point. So I'm noting if a participant passed or failed a task. I'm pulling out quotes, which are a raw form of data. And basically, I'm making sure that I'm not applying any kind of interpretation to it whatsoever when I'm talking about it with, I'm going to use the word client because I work often with clients, but you can sub in stakeholders or multidisciplinary team or whatever is more relevant to the way that you work. And we will be talking about ice cream today. It's just kind of a good way to white label some different projects. But on the right here, there's a couple different examples of pieces of data. So somebody asking about not being able to find the sprinkles, or they under the chocolate chips, or if participant 2 failed to put sprinkles on their ice cream, or someone said this idea is for an ice cream truck is great. So this is exactly what happened. There's no research or interpretation applied to it. We're not triangulating this data against anything. It is simply what occurred. And one of the pitfalls that I find I've fallen into in the past, and I see junior researchers fall into today, is this: when you're communicating data, this idea of an overly formal progress update. So it happens often where maybe we have 2 weeks of data collection. It's a really huge study. And halfway through, we want to give a progress update, or maybe every couple days, we want to give the client a progress update on how things are going with the study. And I feel like there's a temptation, at least I feel a temptation, to create something that's beautiful and a deck that kind of outlines everything in a really like concise way. But there's a lot of value in aligning your presentation fidelity with where you're at in the process. So I find that when giving a progress update, keeping it as informal as humanly possible conveys to the client or to your stakeholders or to your internal team that this is a progress update. We are not at the point of having anything to say yet. We don't know what we don't know what we don't know. So this example of an email is a typical kind of progress update that I might send to a client halfway through a study. There's a couple things in here that I want to call out as being really important when communicating data. So at the top, you'll see I have I couch this pretty heavily in this is all data. This is not findings. This is not insights. So take everything you read here with a grain of salt, open mind. Things will become more clear. And part of this is also educating the client who may not understand the research process, where we're at in the process. So I'm talking about findings and insights and data as different things. So when we get to the point of insights and we get to the point of findings, they have in their head already a mental model of, okay, like we had data, now this is findings, now this is insights. I'm also calling out individual participants instead of giving broad overviews of 3 out of 5 participants we talked to today struggled to do X, because that might change with the next 10 participants that we talk to. Nobody struggled to do X. So if 3 out of 15 participants, it kind of gives the wrong impression when you start to look across participants and triangulate and analyze too early. And you'll also see that below each of the participants, no interpretation applied to what was found, exactly what happened. And these are really useful for clients and stakeholders and project teams that want to be involved, but don't necessarily want to show up to every single interview, and that's okay. I also think that these types of progress updates are really helpful for junior researchers to put together throughout the course of data collection, because it forces you to kind of stay back in the data space without pushing yourself forward to the findings and insight space. So then we get into findings. And Findings are the first layer of synthesis in a review of data. So they should explain what the team witnessed in the study, meaning that their interpretations of the data based on project needs. So this idea of data versus findings versus insights, it can feel a little bit muddy. So this is just how I've decided and figured out how to separate them in my mind throughout the past couple of years. So on the right here, you can see a list of findings. So for example, most participants who failed to find tasks couldn't find items within the mega menu. And then on the left there, I'm trying to allude to the fact that there are multiple pieces of data that support that finding. So there might be an instance where one piece of data equals one finding, but that's pretty rare. You always want to be making sure that you're pulling back to the data as you're defining these findings. Something else that is helpful, I find in talking about findings, is that I try not to quantify things unless they're actually.
Vai ficar gravado.
Oh, if everyone can make sure they're on mute. Cool. I try to make sure that things aren't quantifiable if they're not actually quantifiable. So I wouldn't necessarily say that 2 participants expected sprinkles to be under the chocolate chips, because that gives a false impression to the client or the stakeholder or the project team of quantifiability of that data, when really I'm talking about attitudes and expectations. And when you get into, well, 2 out of the 5 people we talked to felt this way, clients and maybe internal stakeholders might start to dig at that and be like, well, what about the 3rd person who kind of felt that way but didn't really feel that way? How did you determine that they fell into or didn't fall into this bucket? And I find that using most, some, or all kind of language gets us around that type of issue. So the communication pitfall I find in talking about findings is losing the process. So people think that findings are insights, and there's still a long way to go when we're analyzing to get to the level of insights. So as you can see here, most participants who failed to find tasks or failed tasks couldn't find items within the mega menu. Okay, so what? Like, what does that tell us? That's just what happened as it relates to the research questions that we asked. And so sometimes what will happen is we'll present findings in a top line report and people will think, okay, cool, the study's over, when we still have a lot of detailed analysis to do to get us to a place where we can think strategically and make really informed, confident decisions. So what I like to do is make sure that we're always contextualizing within the moment. If you could just make sure you're on mute, that would be cool. Thanks. Just making sure that we could contextualize in the moment exactly where that finding is in the overall process. So this is an example of a top line report. As I mentioned earlier, I like to make sure the fidelity of what I'm presenting is in line with where we're at in the process. So making clear to our client, our internal stakeholders, that we're at the point of analysis. So there's stuff that's coming together. However, we're still in a Miro board. Maybe we're still in a loosey-goosey deck, but there's space for them to collaborate on this and for us to have a conversation around the findings as they come up. You can also notice too, these findings I have associated underneath them the data that supports the finding. So we're not losing that thread of the data through our presentation. And then at the bottom, this is pretty important, but sometimes we forget about it, is making sure that we're always talking about what's coming next, so people don't think this is it. So just making sure that we're always driving ourselves towards action and talking about where we're at in the overall framework to bring people along in this process with us. Getting into then insights. So insights, insight is a fun word. Everyone loves to talk about insights. And talking about insights, I think a lot of times we want to jump the gun and say that this is an insight before it's an insight. But the way that I think about insights are that they're a collection of findings that tell a story, and they tell the project team how those findings should impact the project. So they're so what behind a collection of findings. So maybe this users want access to ice cream anytime, anywhere is the insight. And maybe a bunch of findings within that are around most participants we spoke to wanted to have ice cream during their morning walk. most participants that we spoke to wanted to be able to order ice cream on their phone. And so all of the findings from the study that are aggregates of data points become the support for that insight. So we're kind of like building on the pieces of data and accumulating, going to the next thing, accumulating, going to the next thing, coding and categorizing as we go. But I think what really makes an insight is that we're starting to pull away from just like what occurred in the study, and we're getting into a space of what we can infer from the study. So this is typically where I stop using the word participant and switch over to start using the word user, because we're starting to feel more confident in the outputs that we're putting together because we've spent more time with them. Huge communication pitfall here is losing the data, and losing the data, it's very easy to lose your audience. So I can't tell you how many times I've tried to skip a step or two in this, and sometimes it works if the client or the internal stakeholders are really trusting of my process, and sometimes it doesn't. And then you get to a point where you're presenting insights and somebody's asking very specific questions around, well, where did you get that piece of information, or how did you get to that point? And you always want to be able to go back to the specific moments in your interviews, in your data, to support that insight. And depending on how extensive like the amount of time you have to analyze is, sometimes I'll jump right to findings and then to insights, and then I get to a point where I'm like, crap, and then you have to go back and make sure that the data is all there to support where you got in the end. But you definitely don't want to lose the data, and you always want to be threading it back to that. So this is an example of how I might structure some slides within an insight report. You'll notice that there's one insight per slide. That's really important to me because I find that it keeps people focused and making sure that they are with me in the story. At the end of a presentation, I might have a slide that has all of the insights on it, just so that that's more of a reference point for everybody. But within the story of telling the story of a report, I like to make sure an insight, one per slide. Beneath that, you can see some findings that support that insight. And then to the right, you can see data. So I'm showing the whole process within this one slide. So there's no question of how did I get to that insight. And it also helps whenever you have stakeholders or clients that weren't able to sit in any interviews or any data collection sessions, to be able to see that raw data and feel like they have sat in those sessions, because they're seeing the actual specific participant outcomes from that conversation. Cool. So we've talked about so far data, so what was said, findings, what was heard, insights, what it means, and now we're on to frameworks, so how we think about it. Frameworks are super fun, and there can be a million of them. So I think about frameworks in the way of like experience maps, journey maps, thematic frameworks, personas. What is the word for? I think I called them like schematics, but basically a way of visualizing a problem in a visual way that helps you understand the insights that you derive from it. So on the right here, I have a set of themes that might come from an ice cream related study around efficiency, personalization, and empowerment. Within each of those themes, you have an insight. And then as we talked about, within each insight, you have findings. Within each finding, you have data. So always pulling back to the data. And then beneath that, we have some personas. So the on-the-go ice cream eater and the savor the moment ice cream eater, and some insights associated with them that lead to findings, that lead to data. In terms of personas, I have a lot of feelings about personas. I think a lot of people have a lot of feelings about personas, but typically I like to make sure that the personas that I'm creating are behavioral personas more often than not, and really focus on how the person engages with the actual design that we're creating. And that might be mostly because I'm a super product-oriented researcher. But if you have a more marketing bent, maybe you have a different perspective. But there are a million ways to build a framework, and it's kind of, I think, where researchers get to be really creative in how we communicate our work. The big pitfall I find in frameworks are when you create a super detailed framework that you're really nerdily jazzed about and nobody knows how to read it. So you've spent a lot of time building out a very detailed experience map. You spent a lot of time painstakingly associating data back to insights, back to the step in the process. You've built out very comprehensive user types, but no one knows what to do with it. Like, it's a cool thing that you made, but what do we do with this? And so making sure that you're thinking about these frameworks as tools. So you want to make sure that you're choosing the right framework. So you don't want to make user types when what you really need is an experience map. You want to make sure you're using the right communication tool. So you don't want to put something in Figma if the client never uses Figma. You don't want to put something in Figma if this thing needs to grow and evolve over time and the client doesn't know how to use Figma. So you should probably put it in Miro, even though it's really annoying to design in there. And then the right level of complexity. So thinking about the kind of decisions that you want people to make based on that framework should allow you to think about the level of complexity that that framework has. So a lot of times what we'll do at Craft is we'll have a super high level framework of maybe like different phases in a process, and then we'll be able to create then another framework within that framework that gets us to a level deeper. And then each of those phases in the process might become a different project that we do with the client. So this is just a super high level example of how I might think about an experience map. And like I mentioned, this is just how I do things. This is not how everyone should do things, but these are some core elements of any framework that I try to make sure are included. So making sure that there's either a description of the step or a description of the persona at kind of a very high level, a quote. So we're always pulling back to data in some way, shape, or form. Related personas. So I really like it whenever we're able to build multiple frameworks that work with each other. So we're able to use different frameworks to answer different questions about problem space, or maybe we were able to leverage personas for an ideation session, and the designers can leverage an experience map for building out workflows and things like that. Insights associated with that step. And then we're always pushing to opportunities because we want to make sure that we're always pushing to action and design. And here we are in opportunities. So we talked about data, which is what it is, or what was heard. Findings is, or no, data is what was said, findings is what was heard, insights is what it means, frameworks, how we think about it, opportunities are what we could do. So the way that I like to think about opportunities is when you turn an insight inside out and open it up for exploration. So while insights might explain something, opportunities invite people into the insight to explore. So this is a pitfall that I've encountered earlier in my career, and I see often too with junior designers, is the stopping point at insights. And then sometimes you have designers that are really research oriented and they can pick that up and run with it. But sometimes you have designers that aren't, and that's just not part of their background. And they feel a little bit like, well, what, like, okay, like, what am I supposed to do with this? And opportunities are a really great bridge to kind of get you over that gap between where research ends, which it doesn't ever end, but it ends, and design begins. So for example, on the right here, we have an insight being relying on a mega menu to build an ice cream cone is confusing for users. Cool. I might talk to a designer who then would say, all right, like, what do I do with that? So the opportunity reframe there would be, how might we design a way of navigating the ice cream creation workflow that showcases all of the toppings available to users? And you might have multiple opportunities off of one insight. You might have an insight that doesn't have an opportunity and it's just kind of a nice to know thing. But making sure that we're thinking about opportunities in the way that we communicate in our internal teams, I think is pretty important because it makes our research actionable for people that are researchers. And so I kind of touched on this, but the communication pitfall here is skipping the collaboration. So thinking that we got to insights, I did my job as a researcher, that's it. We want to make sure that everyone is able to be involved, and we open up our insights to allow people to have an entry point into that involvement. So insights can feel very closed off and final, and opportunities open them up again for conversation, discussion, and brainstorming. So using opportunities to guide collaboration, to get us into a brainstorming space, is really important for making sure that everyone's voice is heard in this multidisciplinary design process that at least I work in, and I think a lot of people on the call probably do as well. And finally, we're at recommendations. So if opportunities show us what we could do, recommendations are what we should do. And this is where we get into it with thinking about business requirements, business needs, and the roadmap. So this is another way of reframing an insight. So if an opportunity is one version of a reframed insight, this is another. And this can be defined either by the researcher or in collaboration with designers, or also in collaboration with product owners and product managers. So it's taking an insight and then turning it into an action. So for example, on the right here, current information architecture doesn't support an intuitive ice cream cone building experience for users. We're flipping that then and to say what we're going to do about it, which is determine the most effective way to group toppings. So what we want to make sure when we're defining our recommendations is we're taking into account not just what could be done, but what should be done based on time constraints and business needs. So there's a million different ways that we could address this insight, but based on what the amount of time that we have and the amount of resources that we have, what can we do to address the insight? And that's what recommendations are really about. The pitfall here is unorganized recommendations. So at the end of a study, I've seen it done where maybe there's just this like fire hose of recommendations of here's all the things that we need to do. Like, this is the study, this is what we got to do. And that is also really overwhelming for people, especially if you're not as close to the study as the researcher generally is. So the solution here is collaboration and prioritization and road mapping. So this is getting into a group all together, looking at the recommendations all together, and figuring out when things can happen across a product roadmap. So this is just an example of a fairly typical 2x2 matrix around effort and impact, where as a team, perhaps people came together and started to think about, okay, here's all the recommendations that we got from this research study. What can we do about them and when? So maybe this pink on the homepage was really overwhelming to people and everybody hated it. It's a fairly low effort maybe to tone down the saturation on it, and it would have a huge impact. So that's something that we want to do now. We want to get that low hanging fruit out of the way. But maybe we also, on the other end of the spectrum, it would have a high impact for us to conduct another study to define users' mental models for ice cream creation. And that would be higher effort. So maybe that can't happen right now, but maybe we put that on the roadmap for happening in the next 2 months. So not just thinking about these insights as static things that exist within this findings report, but as action items for us as we move into actually doing things beyond the research. Cool, so getting to some final thoughts on this, as a quick review. So some of the keys that I found to successfully communicating these research outputs are aligning your presentation fidelity in your process. So not making something seem more final than it actually is. But then when you are presenting final things, making them look very nice. Contextualize in the moment. So we want to make sure that when we're presenting findings and data to people, that they know that this isn't it and there's more to come. And we also want to talk about what that more to come could be. So they're not just kind of waiting aimlessly for something. You always want to be threading it back to the data, because without data, we can't have findings or insights or recommendations or opportunities. So we want to make sure that the data is always accessible for us. So whenever anyone has a question about an insight, no matter how far we got away from the data in our inference and analysis, we can always go back to it. choosing the right framework. So making sure that whatever framework we're working with makes sense for the context of the project. And not only that, making sure the framework itself is really easy to understand and action oriented. And then getting everyone involved. So the key, I think, to success in communicating is communicating often about where we're at in this process and making it very clear to people what this process is. So not interchangeably using the words findings and insights, making sure that everybody can kind of see within the project timeline where we're at with research against what the deliverables are for the research, all of that kind of stuff. And then, of course, pulling people in through the opportunity process into brainstorming and things like that. And then finally, prioritize and roadmap. So pushing beyond just ending at insights as researchers, we want to make sure that we're involved in the conversations around what do we do about this. So pulling up insights into the road mapping conversations, making sure that our recommendations take into account business constraints, not wanting to present things to people that we know can't happen. We might want to note that, but we don't want to belabor the point if we know that we don't live in a reality where this insight is going to be able to be addressed. So making sure that we are living in the project timeline and not just our research bubble, as much as I love my research bubble. So at a high level, this is everything that we talked about today. I know it's a little bit of a lot to look at, but we've got outputs across the top, some of the activities that we can do around those outputs, and then the ways that I've talked through communicating those outputs. So that is everything that I had to cover today. I hope this was helpful or somewhat insightful. Like I mentioned, thank you to Misha, who I don't know if she's on the call. If she's not, you all know now that Misha Cobb made these lovely illustrations, and all of the designers at Craft who put together this Figma template that I definitely completely broke. And then of course, Condens for inviting me to do this. And feel free to reach out after this if you have any questions beyond the hour. Yeah, and I have a couple of questions just to think about as we leave today and talk through this for the next couple of minutes.